Is a diagnosis of autism needed? Or is a diagnosis of ADHD or dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, are all these things needed? And that's a really complex thing to answer because it depends on who you are, what your circumstances are, where you are on your journey. So, diagnosis in the UK, which is where I'm based, the current waiting list for an autism diagnosis are 122,000 people are currently waiting. That's insane. That's 40% more people seeking a diagnosis. So, the thing we have to establish straight away is diagnosis is a privilege. What I mean by that is to get a diagnosis, it means you're in a privileged position. You may not feel like it, you may hate the diagnosis, you may wish it never happened. What I'm referring to is a lot of people that want a diagnosis struggle to get one. And so for them, it feels like those that have been lucky enough to get a diagnosis are in a good position. When I say lucky enough, what I mean is people are waiting 4 years or more to get a diagnosis on the NHS. It varies from area to area. There's what we call a postcode lottery, which means there's different services or different wait times, different access to different services in different areas. There's also different support. So in some areas you need a diagnosis to access certain support, whereas in another area you might not. Some areas, your mental health condition may mean you get the support that maybe you can't get elsewhere with the same mental health condition, or maybe you can only get it under autism services. So you might want a diagnosis because it gives you access to certain support. Sometimes a diagnosis allows you to access autism-specific services in other areas that are not autism-specific services at all. In some areas, autistic people are covered under the learning disability services, which perhaps they shouldn't be, but sometimes there are no autism services. Sometimes autism services in some areas go, even if you've got a diagnosis, they go, no. They go, this should be covered by mental health. And mental health go, no, it should be covered by autism. And you can't get the support you need even with a diagnosis. In my area, there's a lot of support. There's a lot of support for autistic people. Some of that support you have to have a diagnosis for. So that might be a reason you want a diagnosis for support. There are other things where you don't need a diagnosis. It's based on your difficulty. When it comes to benefits, you don't need a diagnosis for a lot of benefits in the UK. Benefits are social securities. They're money you can receive from the state in order to support your living. Maybe that's supporting you because of your disability, or maybe that's supporting you while you look for work, or maybe that's supporting you so you can work an appropriate amount for you and your health and your mind. A lot of that is based on your difficulty rather than a diagnosis. So you don't need a diagnosis to claim it. You can put down that you have or are autistic, but it's really descriptions of how you struggle that mean you get access to that. A lot of things are like that. It's the same with equality laws in the UK. The Equality Act is based on a challenge, not a diagnosis. When it comes to the education healthcare plans, those are the documents that young people, children get to access support in school. You don't need a diagnosis to receive that. That's based on your need, your presentation, your difficulties. So diagnosis can, though, make it easier to get those things, or more clear that you need specific support. It can add weight sometimes to arguments around support, but there's a lot of things that you can get without a diagnosis, though it may be more harder to get them without that diagnosis. So what are the reasons might you want a diagnosis? Just feeling like you make sense. It's identity. This is who I am. It's approved, it's stamped, it's real, it's a thing, it's not in my head. The things I've been struggling with my entire life are this, I am this. Professionals have diagnosed me. I have a reason, an explanation for my behavior, for my challenges. That is, again, I feel that's a completely valid reason. Often, though, you can't get a diagnosis even if you are, because diagnosis criteria are often based on difficulty. So you may be autistic but not facing certain life challenges. So therefore, you wouldn't necessarily get a diagnosis because diagnosis is based on difficulty. If you don't have many challenges, often because wait times are so long for a diagnosis, places will triage, which is where they diagnose those with the most need sooner and those with the least need later. So, and as waiting lists are getting longer and longer and longer, that means if you don't have any really pressing difficulties, you will be waiting even longer. I could not even tell you how many more years it might be at all. So among myself and a lot of my autistic friends and a lot of the autistic trainers and colleagues that I work with, we view self-diagnosis as valid. And now in the UK, even organisations are hiring self-diagnosed people as autistic expert by experience, or E/Es as they're called, as trainers. And that's because we understand to get a diagnosis, there is those barriers. We talked about it being a privilege. The first privilege that we mentioned was how waitlists are so long. So getting a diagnosis is a challenge. Another barrier is if you don't have the typical textbook autism expressions of autism. We know that diagnostic criteria in the past was based on, to put it bluntly, white Western males. And so if you're not a white Western male, then you might potentially struggle. All diagnostic criteria had Western play activities in it. It's very male-centric in how it talks about socialization and someone's interests. And we now know, lots of more recent evidence shows that how children interact on the playground is different depending on whether they're assigned female or assigned male. I say assigned male, assigned female, because lots of autistic people do not identify as the gender that we were assigned to at birth. So we may socialize differently because of that, because we don't fit in or agree with those labels. But yes, because children interact differently on the playground, they do different things. We are conditioned by society from such a young age, that's going to have an impact on our presentation. And so a young autistic girl might act very differently than a young autistic boy, AMAB. So this can mean that there's many reasons, but girls end up getting misdiagnosed. So they get diagnosed with anxiety disorders or personality disorders or anxiety and depression, or they get called highly sensitive people rather than autistic. So they may be less likely to be diagnosed or picked up, more likely to be dismissed. Boys, for various reasons, might be more obvious in their presentation. I'm not going to deep dive into that. That's just another reason why a diagnosis is a privilege, or is viewed as a privilege, because if you are a person of colour, or if you are AFAB, which is assigned female at birth, you might have more difficulty in getting a diagnosis. You mean you might seek out a diagnosis and even though you are not, get one, because you may be going to get a diagnosis, but the people diagnosing you are not. They've got a big mental health background and they're used to seeing AFABs in inpatient mental health units that have personality disorders, and that's what they may see in you when actually you are autistic. That's actually a big problem. We often have girls that get misdiagnosed with things like BPD or EUPD, that emotionally unstable personality disorder, when they're actually autistic. Great frustration point. So first of all, why do you want a diagnosis? We've got that you get access to services, that you've got validation for your identity, for who you are. However, you could see there are drawbacks. If you do get a diagnosis, you could be fearful of the consequences of that. In the UK, we have registers for those that have a risk of entering hospital, the Dynamic Support Register. And the idea behind this is it keeps a record of the people are likely to end up needing access or ending up in a hospital, mental health hospital. And the point of that is to help avoid admission to mental health hospitals. But some people may be afraid of it being recorded on their GP's record, or to get something called annual health check, which is being rolled out for autistic people. There's these registers, basically. And some people are scared of these things being documented. We had a scandal in the UK that's ongoing recently, which is where during COVID, a lot of learning disabled and autistic people found out they had do not resuscitate orders given or put on their record without their consent by healthcare professionals. That's scary. That's scary because that means if you've got COVID or something has gone wrong and you need to be resuscitated, it's not going to happen, and you didn't consent or agree to that. And some people worry about that. Some people worry about the consequences. Are they going to be treated kindly or fairly? Or if someone notices this on the system, are they going to misunderstand? Are they going to think about past misconceptions? Because back when a lot of us got trained in the past, what did we see as autism? We saw Rain Man. And that's with Dustin Hoffman. We saw very different expressions of what we were taught, very different things about what autism is than now we know. And some people you're meeting, some healthcare professionals that will see autism next to your name, might have very wrong knowledge about what autism actually is. They might think you lack capacity, or that you're incapable, or that you're a genius that is also at the same time incapable of, I don't know, tying their own shoelaces. They can have all sorts of weird beliefs about who you are, and that may affect how they communicate with you, how they treat you. They may override your decisions. There's meant to be processes in place to prevent this. So you don't do things without someone's consent. You don't do things without seeing if someone has capacity, and capacity has to be specific. But we all probably know examples of where the rules haven't been followed, and this scares people. So there's very valid reasons why people may not want to seek out a diagnosis. And I can't argue with those things. I myself have a diagnosis. It's on paper. It's on the internet here. And I still know in situations I'm constantly fighting against other people's misconceptions. I'm constantly having those microaggressions of, oh, it's so great that you're here. It's so wonderful that someone like you exists, works. The implications are there. It's so good. Oh, it's so good that you're here. Oh, you're so great. You're so brave. A diagnosis can be scary. It can lead to problems. It can lead to complications. It can give you access to it can make you feel like you've got access to a community, or services. Well, to be honest, if you feel like you need a diagnosis to get access to it, if people are excluding you from a social circle because you don't have a diagnosis, then they're wrong, because it is hard to get a diagnosis. If you go private, it costs a lot of money. I'm frequently now teaching parents that have gone the private route, and it costs currently £1,500 to £4,000, depending on what diagnostic criteria you go through. We've got the ADOS, or we've got the DISCO, the various schedules and what tick boxes and tests you do to find out someone's autistic, and some of them are more effective at picking up girls, or PDA, or demand avoidant type behaviors. The point is, it's expensive to go private, and if you don't go private, it's a long waiting list. So yeah, it's a privilege. So you may not want a diagnosis, and I think that you're completely valid if you don't.